Thunder cracked across the Alaskan sky like a whip, sending tremors through the dense forest below. Sage Morrison gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white against the metal frame as she watched the storm transform the peaceful wilderness into something far more menacing. The rain had started as a gentle patter an hour ago, but now it hammered down with such force that the drops felt like tiny bullets against her skin. She hadn't meant to venture this far from the trail. The morning had started perfectly. Crisp autumn air, clear skies, and a sense of freedom she hadn't felt since the rock climbing accident 6 months ago. At 16, Sage had grown tired of everyone treating her like she was made of glass. This solo trip was supposed to prove something. To herself, to her overprotective father, to everyone who looked at her with pity in their eyes. The wooden bridge she had crossed earlier now groaned under the weight of the rising water, its ancient planks shuddering with each surge of the flood. Sage's heart pounded as she watched entire trees being swept downstream, their massive trunks tossed around like twigs in a child's game. The path behind her had turned into a river of mud, and her wheels were already starting to sink into the softening earth. A flash of movement caught her eye, something massive shifting between the trees on the other side of the rising water. At first, she thought it was another fallen tree, but then she saw it move with purpose, with intelligence. Through the curtain of rain, she glimpsed a dark shape that made her blood run cold. Whatever it was watching her, and it was getting closer. The bridge gave one final, terrible groan. Sage watched in horror as the structure that had been her only way home began to splinter and crack. She tried to turn her chair, to find higher ground, but the wheels only sank deeper into the mud. The thunder above seemed to mock her attempts at escape. Each boom a reminder of how desperately alone she was in this moment. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about survival, about fear, and about the true nature of the wild. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes, and that was starting to seem impossible as the water continued to rise around her. The rain hammered harder now, turning the world into a blur of grays and dark greens. Sage's clothes were soaked through, her dark hair plastered against her face as she fought to keep her chair steady. She reached for her phone, knowing even before she pulled it out that there would be no signal here. The screen flickered weakly, showing the no service message she dreaded, before dying completely. The battery had finally given up. "Think, Sage, think," she muttered, trying to channel her father's survival lessons. Before the accident, they had spent countless weekends in these woods. He had taught her everything about wilderness survival, how to read weather patterns, track animals, find shelter. But none of those lessons had covered what to do when you're stranded in a wheelchair during a flash flood. A massive tree branch crashed into the failing bridge, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Sage instinctively covered her face, her heart racing as she heard the final death throes of the structure. The sound of splintering wood was almost deafening, competing with the thunder overhead as the bridge finally gave way, disappearing into the churning waters below. The mysterious shape in the trees moved again, closer this time. Through the sheets of rain, Sage could make out more details, and her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just big, it was enormous. A grizzly bear, its wet fur making it look even more massive than usual, emerged from the tree line. Its muscles rippled with each movement as it surveyed the scene before it, intelligent eyes taking in both Sage and the rising floodwaters. Sage's mind raced through everything she knew about bears. Make yourself look big, impossible from her chair. Make noise, likely useless over the storm. Play dead, that was for attacks, and she couldn't exactly run anyway. The bear was between her and any potential path to higher ground, and her wheels were now stuck firmly in the mud, the water beginning to lap at her footrests. The bear took another step forward, and Sage's hands trembled as she gripped her armrests. She had always imagined she would die doing something exciting. Climbing a mountain maybe, or exploring some remote corner of the world. Not like this, trapped and helpless as both a flood and a grizzly bear closed in on her. But then something strange happened. The bear tilted its head, almost like it was puzzled by her presence. It let out a low grunt, nothing like the aggressive sound Sage had expected. Its eyes, deep brown and surprisingly expressive, seemed to hold something beyond mere animal instinct. The bear looked from Sage to the rising water, then back to Sage again, as if it was assessing the situation. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that Sage felt in her bones. The bear didn't even flinch. Instead, it took another deliberate step toward her, and in that moment Sage realized two things. She had absolutely no escape route, and this bear was acting like no bear she had ever heard of. The freezing water had now reached her ankles, numbing her feet even through her waterproof boots. Sage could feel the current trying to pull her chair, the metal frame creaking as it resisted the force of the flood. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, from a camping trip years ago when they'd watched a mother bear fishing in a stream. Bears are smarter than most people give them credit for. They can problem solve, show empathy, even help each other out sometimes. At the time, she'd thought he was just trying to make nature documentaries more interesting for her. Now, she wondered if there had been more truth to his words than she'd realized. The grizzly was close enough now that Sage could see the rain rolling off its thick fur, creating small rivers that ran down its massive shoulders. Its claws, each longer than her fingers, dug into the muddy ground with each step. But it was the bear's eyes that held her attention, deep, intelligent, and filled with something that looked almost like concern. No, that was impossible. She had to be projecting human emotions onto it because of her fear. A violent surge of water slammed into her chair, nearly tipping it sideways. Sage let out a desperate cry as she gripped the armrests, trying to maintain her balance. The sound seemed to trigger something in the bear. It moved with surprising speed, closing the remaining distance between them in 3 powerful strides. Sage squeezed her eyes shut, certain that this was the end. But the attack she expected never came. Instead, she felt a gentle pressure against her chair, and her eyes flew open in disbelief. The bear had positioned itself on the upstream side of her wheelchair, using its massive body as a shield against the current. The water that had been threatening to overwhelm her now broke against the bear's bulk, creating a small pocket of relative calm around her chair. "This can't be happening," Sage whispered, her voice trembling. The bear turned its head at the sound of her voice, and their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them. An understanding that transcended the natural order of things. This creature, this wild and powerful being that should have seen her as prey, was choosing to protect her instead. The bear let out another low grunt, this one somehow managing to sound encouraging. Then, with deliberate movements, it lowered its head and carefully caught the frame of her wheelchair between its teeth. Sage held her breath, expecting to feel the metal bend or break, but the bear's grip was surprisingly gentle. It reminded her of how she'd once watched a mother cat carrying her kittens, firm enough to hold on, but careful not to cause harm. The real shock came when the bear began to pull. With strength that seemed almost impossible, it started to drag her chair backward, away from the deepest part of the flooding. The wheels that had been hopelessly stuck in the mud began to move under the bear's powerful guidance. Each step was careful, measured, as if the bear understood the precariousness of her situation. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and Sage caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat. On the bear's left ear was a small, silvery tag, the kind used by wildlife researchers to track animals. Suddenly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving began to fall into place. She remembered a news story from last year about a research project studying bear intelligence and behavior in this part of Alaska. The researchers had reported some extraordinary findings, but most people had dismissed them as exaggerations or flukes. The bear continued its rescue mission, undeterred by the storm raging around them. As they moved slowly but steadily toward higher ground, Sage's mind raced with questions. Was this one of the bears from that research project? Had it somehow learned to recognize humans in distress? Or was there something even more extraordinary happening here? Something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals? The journey uphill was painfully slow. Every few feet, the bear would pause, readjusting its grip on the wheelchair's frame with surprising gentleness. The metal creaked under the pressure but held firm. Sage found herself holding her breath each time the bear repositioned. Not from fear anymore, but from sheer amazement at the careful precision of each movement. This creature, which could easily crush her chair like a tin can, was handling it with the delicacy of a surgeon. Through the curtain of rain, Sage spotted a natural shelter ahead, a rocky overhang that jutted out from the hillside. The bear seemed to be steering them directly toward it, as if it had known about this sanctuary all along. Perhaps it had. This was its territory, after all. The thought made Sage wonder how many times this bear had weathered storms under that very same overhang. As they approached the shelter, something caught Sage's eye that made her breath catch in her throat. Under the overhang, partially hidden by shadows, she could make out what looked like old camping gear. A tattered backpack, some rusted tins, and what might have once been a sleeping bag. Someone else had found themselves stranded here before. Had the bear helped them too? The implications made her head spin. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the valley behind them, followed by an earth-shaking crash. Sage twisted in her chair to look back, just in time to see several massive trees succumb to the flood, their root systems torn from the saturated earth. The water was still rising, carrying with it an ever-growing collection of debris, branches, logs, and even what looked like pieces of someone's deck. The path they had just traveled was now completely submerged. The bear gave one final, powerful pull, and suddenly they were under the overhang. The difference was immediate. The howling wind and pounding rain reduced to a distant roar, the ground beneath them solid rock instead of treacherous mud. Sage's chair left wet tracks on the stone as the bear carefully maneuvered her into the deepest part of the shelter, where the overhang provided the most protection. Once Sage was securely positioned, the bear released its grip on her chair and took a step back. Water cascaded from its fur as it shook itself, reminding Sage of a massive dog after a swim. The comparison almost made her laugh. Here she was, comparing one of nature's most fearsome predators to a pet. But then again, nothing about this situation followed the natural order of things. The bear's behavior became even more extraordinary in the relative calm of their shelter. Instead of leaving now that she was safe, it began to pace the entrance of their sanctuary, its massive body positioned between Sage and the storm. Every few minutes, it would turn its head to look at her, as if checking that she was still okay. The research tag on its ear glinted whenever lightning flashed, a constant reminder that there might be more to this bear's story than mere animal instinct. Sage's hands were shaking as she reached into her jacket pocket, hoping against hope that her father's old emergency whistle was still there. Her fingers closed around the familiar metal cylinder. She had kept it with her ever since the accident, a tangible reminder of all the wilderness lessons he had taught her. The bear's head swiveled toward her as she withdrew the whistle, its eyes showing not aggression, but what looked remarkably like recognition. The silver tag caught the light again, and this time, Sage could make out some numbers etched into its surface. Project Echo, Subject 17. The name tickled something in her memory. Hadn't there been a controversial research program a few years back, studying the potential for enhanced communication between humans and large predators? The project had been shut down amid skepticism and budget cuts, but rumors had circulated about remarkable breakthroughs just before its closure. A fresh wave of thunder rolled overhead, and Sage noticed something she had missed before. When each thunderclap sounded, the bear's reaction seemed almost practiced. It would pause its pacing, cock its head slightly as if counting, then resume its protective patrol. This wasn't just unusual behavior, it was learned behavior. But who had taught it, and why? The questions multiplied in Sage's mind, each one more intriguing than the last. The abandoned camping gear beneath the overhang kept drawing her attention. Carefully, Sage maneuvered her chair closer to investigate. The backpack, though weather-beaten, wasn't as old as she had first thought. Its fabric still held traces of its original blue color, and the zippers, while rusty, hadn't completely deteriorated. With trembling fingers, she reached out and pulled it closer. The bear watched her movements but made no attempt to stop her exploration. Inside the backpack, protected from the worst of the elements, Sage found a notebook. Its pages were warped from humidity, but much of the writing was still legible. As she began to read, her heart started racing. The notebook belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the lead researchers from Project Echo. The entries detailed months of work with Subject 17, the very bear that had just saved her life. Day 89. Breakthrough with S-17 today, one entry read. The cognitive tests show something extraordinary. She's not just learning commands, she's understanding context. When we simulated emergency scenarios, she began responding without prompts, actively looking for ways to help. It's like she's developed a type of empathy we never thought possible in Ursi Dai. Sage looked up at the bear, at S-17, with new understanding. The massive creature had settled at the entrance of their shelter, still maintaining its vigilant watch. In the dim light, Sage could see old scars on its muzzle and paws, telling stories of a life lived wild despite its unusual upbringing. The bear turned its head, meeting her gaze with those intelligent eyes, and Sage felt a connection that transcended the natural order of things. The notebook contained more revelations. Dr. Chen had documented increasingly remarkable behaviors. S-17, learning to manipulate complex mechanisms, showing signs of understanding human emotional states, and even attempting to communicate through a series of learned gestures. But the final entries took on a more urgent tone. Day 156. They're shutting us down. Our findings are too controversial, they say. The potential for public panic about enhanced predator intelligence is too great. What they don't understand is that we're not enhancing anything. We're simply revealing capabilities that were there all along. S-17 and the others like her could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, of the relationship between humans and wildlife. But instead, they're going to terminate the project and release the subjects back into the wild. The last entry was tear-stained and hastily written. Final day. I can't bring myself to undo what S-17 has learned. The protocols call for conditioning that would make her fear humans again, return her to a natural state. but there's nothing unnatural about empathy, about the desire to help others. I'm leaving this record here, in her favorite shelter, hoping that someday someone will understand what we discovered. S-17 isn't just a test subject. She's proof that the line between human and animal consciousness is far blurrier than we ever imagined. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Sage jump, and she noticed something she had missed in her absorption with the notebook. The water level outside their shelter was still rising, and now small rivulets were beginning to trickle across the rock floor. S-17 had noticed, too. The bear's posture had changed, becoming more alert, more focused. She, and Sage now thought of the bear as definitively female, moved closer to the wheelchair, her movements deliberate and purposeful. The bear made a series of short, huffing sounds, then raised her right paw, touching it briefly to her own chest before extending it toward Sage. The gesture was so human-like that Sage gasped. She flipped frantically through the notebook until she found a page of documented signals. There it was, the chest touch followed by an outward gesture. In Project Echo's research, this had been one of S-17's most sophisticated learned behaviors. It meant, roughly translated, trust me, follow my lead. The implications were staggering. Not only had S-17 retained her training through years in the wild, but she was consciously choosing to use it now, to communicate with a human she had never met. The bear wasn't just acting on instinct or even on simple trained responses. She was analyzing their situation, making decisions, and attempting to convey her intentions. A loud crack from above made them both look up. Small pieces of rock were beginning to fall from the overhang as water seeped through previously invisible cracks in the stone. S-17's ears flattened against her head, and she made another series of gestures, this time touching her paw to her ear, then pointing upward. Sage frantically searched the notebook again. The ear touch was a signal for danger, and the upward point. Her blood ran cold as she understood. The bear was warning her that their shelter might collapse. The realization brought with it a fresh wave of fear. The wheelchair that had seemed like such a prison earlier now felt like an even bigger liability. Even if they could find another safe spot, how would they reach it through the deepening water and strengthening current? S-17 seemed to sense her rising panic. The bear moved closer, her massive form blocking Sage's view of the chaos outside. Then, with deliberate movements, she began to perform a series of gestures that Sage recognized from deeper in the notebook. Paw to chest, then to ear, then a sweeping motion toward the back of the cave. Circle motion, followed by 2 quick taps on the ground. According to Dr. Chen's notes, this was one of the most complex communication sequences S-17 had mastered. The bear was telling her there was another way out, a path that led up through the back of the overhang to higher ground. Just then, Sage's father's emergency whistle slipped from her pocket, clattering against the rock floor. The sound triggered something in S-17's memory. The bear's head snapped toward the whistle, and her eyes showed a flash of recognition. Sage remembered another passage from the notebook. They had used whistle commands during the project, teaching the bears to respond to different patterns of sounds. With trembling hands, she picked up the whistle. "You remember this, don't you?" she whispered. S-17's focused attention was answer enough. Sage carefully attached the whistle to her jacket zipper where it would be easily accessible. If they got separated in their escape attempt, it might be their only way to find each other again. The water was now flowing steadily across the rock floor, soaking the abandoned backpack and threatening to wash away the precious notebook. Sage quickly stuffed the research journal inside her rain jacket, protecting Dr. Chen's invaluable observations. More rocks fell from above, some now larger than her fist. They needed to move, and soon. Yacht 17 began to pace anxiously between Sage and the back of the shelter, each pass becoming more urgent. The bear's behavior reminded Sage of her old service dog, Max, who used to guide her to important things she might have missed. The comparison gave her an idea. She pulled out the whistle again and, following the pattern shown in one of Dr. Chen's diagrams, blew 2 short blasts followed by 1 long one, the project's signal for "Show me." The response was immediate. S-17's ears perked up, and she moved with newfound purpose toward a section of the rock wall that had seemed solid at first glance. Now, looking more carefully, Sage could see that what appeared to be a dead end was actually a narrow crevice, partially hidden by years of debris and vegetation. It was a tight fit, but possibly wide enough for her chair if they were careful. The bear began clearing the entrance with powerful sweeps of her paws, revealing more of the hidden passage. As she worked, Sage noticed something else extraordinary. S-17 would periodically stop, test the stability of the rock she was moving, and adjust her approach if anything seemed unsafe. This wasn't just brute force. It was calculated, methodical problem-solving. A deep rumbling from above spurred them into greater urgency. The entire overhang shuddered, and a sheet of water suddenly poured through a new crack in the ceiling. S-17 abandoned her careful clearing of the passage and moved back to Sage's chair with determined strides. The bear's message was clear. They were out of time. They would have to attempt the escape now, ready or not. The next few moments would test not just their unusual partnership, but everything Dr. Chen's research had suggested about enhanced ursine intelligence. As Sage gripped her chair's arms and nodded her readiness to S-17, she realized that they were about to either prove or disprove Project Echo's most controversial hypothesis, that bears like S-17 could not only learn complex behaviors, but could adapt them to entirely new situations under extreme pressure. The passage entrance was barely wider than her wheelchair. S-17 had managed to clear most of the debris, but the space remained daunting. The bear positioned herself behind the chair, and Sage felt the now familiar gentle pressure of teeth gripping the frame. But this time, something was different. Instead of pulling straight back, S-17 began to angle the chair slightly, turning it 45 degrees to the passage entrance. Sage's eyes widened as she understood. The bear had figured out that the chair would fit better at an angle, a geometric solution that showed remarkable spatial awareness. Water was now pouring into their shelter from multiple cracks in the ceiling, creating small waterfalls that reduced visibility and made the rock floor treacherously slick. A large chunk of the overhang crashed down behind them, missing them by inches. The impact sent vibrations through the entire structure, and a fine rain of rock dust and pebbles showered down from above. Sage could hear the groaning of stressed stone. The whole formation was becoming unstable. The first attempt to enter the passage didn't work. The chair's wheels caught on an unseen ridge in the rock floor, causing them to stick. S-17 immediately stopped pushing when she felt the resistance, another sign of her remarkable sensitivity. The bear made a low huffing sound, then moved around to the front of the chair. She began clearing the ridge with her claws, meticulously removing the obstacle while constantly glancing up at the deteriorating ceiling. Dr. Chen's notebook pressed against Sage's chest inside her jacket, a reminder of the extraordinary nature of what she was witnessing. This bear wasn't just strong or well-trained. She was problem-solving in real time, adapting her responses to unexpected challenges. The project's researchers had theorized about this level of cognitive flexibility, but had they ever seen it demonstrated so dramatically? A new sound cut through the chaos, a deep, resonant cracking that seemed to come from the very heart of the rock. S-17's head snapped up, her ears swiveling to track the noise. Without hesitation, she returned to the back of the wheelchair and gripped the frame again. This time, when she pushed, she first lifted slightly, then moved forward, clearing the remaining ridge. The wheels found purchase on the smoother rock beyond, and they began to make progress into the passage. The tunnel was a tight fit, just as Sage had feared. The walls pressed in on both sides of her chair, occasionally catching on the wheels or armrests. Each time this happened, S-17 would adjust their angle with incredible precision, sometimes having to back up and try a different approach. The bear's patience was remarkable. Even as the sounds of collapse grew louder behind them, she never resorted to brute force, seeming to understand the delicate balance required to navigate the narrow space. Sage's father had once told her that in survival situations, time seemed to move differently, either too fast or impossibly slow. In the passage, she experienced both. Each foot of progress felt like it took hours, yet the urgent deterioration of the shelter behind them marked the rapid passage of real time. Water was following them into the tunnel now, creating small rapids around the wheels of her chair. The current tried to pull them backward, but S-17's strength and determination kept them moving forward. The bear's fur brushed against Sage's arm as they maneuvered through a particularly tight turn, and she was struck by how warm it felt despite being soaked through. The contact reminded her that this was a living, breathing being, making conscious choices to help her. She found herself talking to S-17, offering quiet words of encouragement, just as she would have done with her service dog. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and her movements seemed to become even more determined. About 30 feet into the passage, they encountered their biggest challenge yet. The tunnel split into two branches, one sloping upward but partially blocked by fallen rocks, the other wider but continuing at the same level. S-17 released the wheelchair and moved forward to investigate both options. The bear's behavior was methodical. She tested the stability of the rocks in the upward passage, then checked the floor of the level 1. Water was flowing more strongly through the level passage, suggesting it might lead downward further ahead, a dangerous prospect given the flooding. Sage reached for the whistle, remembering another set of signals from the notebook. 3 short blasts meant danger in Project Echo's command system. She blew 3 quick notes, then pointed to the level passage. S-17 turned to look at her, then made the ear-touching gesture that confirmed danger. They were communicating, actually working together to make this critical decision. The bear returned to the wheelchair and began carefully maneuvering them toward the upward branch. They would have to deal with the fallen rocks, but at least they would be moving away from the flood. The first obstacle in the upward passage was a boulder about the size of a mini-fridge, wedged at an awkward angle that left only a small gap at the top. Water trickled around its base, suggesting that the space underneath was already becoming flooded. S-17 released the wheelchair and circled the boulder, examining it from all angles. Her behavior reminded Sage of the way her father would assess a challenging climbing route, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. The bear's next actions demonstrated problem-solving abilities that would have astounded Dr. Chen's research team. Instead of trying to move the boulder directly, S-17 began clearing smaller rocks from around its base. She was undermining it, creating a controlled way for it to shift. Each rock she removed was placed deliberately behind them, building a crude but effective barrier against the rising water that pursued them through the tunnel. As Sage watched, she pulled out the notebook again, using the light from her phone's lock screen to illuminate the pages. The phone itself was dead, but the screen still lit up briefly with each button press. In the dim light, she found an entry that made her breath catch. Day 112. Ya-17 demonstrated tool use today. not just using objects as tools, but creating tools by modifying objects. She broke a branch to make it fit into a narrow space, then used it as a lever. This goes beyond what we thought possible. A sharp crack echoed through the tunnel as the boulder shifted slightly. S-17 had cleared enough of its foundation that gravity was beginning to take over. The bear quickly returned to Sage's chair, positioning herself between the wheelchair and the unstable rock. Another crack, louder this time, and the boulder began to tilt. S-17's muscles tensed, ready to protect Sage if anything went wrong. The boulder didn't fall as expected. Instead, it rotated about 45 degrees and wedged itself in a new position, creating a larger gap at the top, but also sending a shower of smaller rocks clattering down the passage. One stone struck Sage's armrest, leaving a deep dent in the metal. Without hesitation, S-17 pressed her body against the chair, shielding Sage from the rest of the falling debris. When the dust settled, they faced a new challenge. The gap was larger now, but reaching it would require lifting the wheelchair higher than before. S-17 seemed to understand this immediately. She made a series of short, huffing sounds and gentle nudges against Sage's arm, a behavior that, according to the notebook, indicated she wanted Sage's attention and cooperation. The bear then did something extraordinary. She moved to the front of the chair and made a gesture Sage hadn't seen before, touching her paw to her chest, then to the ground, then raising it up. When Sage didn't immediately respond, S-17 repeated the sequence, this time looking pointedly at Sage's seatbelt. Suddenly, Sage understood. The bear wanted her to release the belt, to allow herself to be lifted separately from the chair. The realization brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Since the accident, Sage had developed an almost superstitious attachment to her seatbelt. It represented safety, control, a barrier between her and further injury. But as she heard the water rising behind their makeshift barrier, she knew they had no choice. They couldn't get the chair through the gap in one piece. They would have to separate her from it. Sage's hands trembled as she reached for the seatbelt release. The click of the buckle seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. S-17 waited patiently, her eyes showing an almost human understanding of Sage's hesitation. The bear's presence was remarkably comforting. This wasn't like being lifted by paramedics or helped by well-meaning strangers. This was a partnership, a collaboration between two beings who had found each other against impossible odds. The sound of their barrier beginning to crumble spurred them into action. S-17 moved with careful precision, positioning herself so that Sage could grip her fur. The bear's movements were incredibly gentle as she helped Sage slide from the chair onto her broad shoulders. The sensation was unlike anything Sage had experienced. S-17's fur was thick and surprisingly soft, providing secure handholds despite being wet. Once Sage was safely positioned, S-17 turned her attention to the wheelchair. The bear gripped one of the wheels in her teeth and began to fold the chair with remarkable dexterity. Project Echo must have included training with human objects, because S-17 seemed to understand exactly how the mechanism worked. Within moments, she had collapsed the chair into its most compact form. The bear's demonstration of fine motor control and mechanical comprehension would have revolutionized our understanding of animal intelligence, if only someone had been there to document it. The sound of rushing water grew louder behind them, and Sage could feel S-17's muscles tense beneath her. The bear made a series of quick, decisive movements, first pushing the folded wheelchair through the gap above the tilted boulder, then positioning herself for their own passage through the narrow space. Sage pressed herself as flat as possible against S-17's broad back, her fingers entwined in the thick fur. The bear's warmth beneath her was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the cold dampness of the tunnel. As they began to move through the gap, Sage found herself remembering the last time she had been this close to a wild animal. It was during her rehabilitation after the accident, when a therapy horse named Thunder had helped her regain her confidence. But this was different. Thunder had been trained from birth to work with humans. S-17 was a wild creature who had chosen to help her, who had retained not just her training, but her understanding of human vulnerability. The passage through the gap was terrifyingly tight. S-17 moved with incredible precision, adjusting her body millimeter by millimeter to protect Sage from the rough stone edges. At one point, the bear had to virtually crawl on her belly, keeping her back as level as possible to prevent Sage from being scraped against the ceiling. The complexity of these movements, the careful calculation of space and pressure, spoke to an intelligence that went far beyond instinct or simple training. Halfway through the gap, Sage felt something warm trickle down her arm. In the dim light, she realized with a start that it was blood. S-17 had scraped her shoulder against the rock while keeping Sage clear of it. The bear had deliberately taken an injury to protect her passenger. This level of self-sacrifice wasn't supposed to be possible in wild animals. Yet here was S-17, putting herself in harm's way not for food or survival, but to help a human she had just met. Just as they were about to clear the gap, a deep rumble echoed through the tunnel. The sound was different from before, not the sharp crack of breaking rock, but a deeper, more resonant vibration that Sage felt in her bones. S-17 froze for a split second, then surged forward with sudden urgency. They cleared the gap just as the rumbling reached a crescendo, and Sage heard a sound like 1,000 rivers rushing at once. The flash flood had finally broken through their barrier. S-17 didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, she snatched up the folded wheelchair in her jaws and bounded up the incline of the tunnel. Water rushed past them, turning the narrow passage into a deadly chute of debris and foam. The bear's paws found purchase on rocks that seemed impossibly small, her movements displaying an almost supernatural combination of power and precision. Sage clung to S-17's fur, her world reduced to the rhythm of the bear's movement and the roar of the water behind them. She could feel every muscle group engaging as S-17 navigated the treacherous terrain. Powerful shoulders and legs working in perfect coordination, each step calculated to maintain both speed and stability. This wasn't just escape. It was a masterclass in adaptive movement. The tunnel began to lighten ahead of them, suggesting an opening to the surface. But with the light came a new challenge. The passage narrowed again, this time vertically. S-17 would have to crouch even lower, and with the water rising rapidly behind them, any delay could be fatal. The bear made a series of quick, huffing sounds, a pattern that Sage had noticed her use when working through a problem. Then S-17 did something that demonstrated an understanding of physics that should have been impossible for a wild animal. She turned sideways, pressing her back against one wall of the tunnel while bracing her paws against the other. This created a stable platform for Sage while reducing their combined height. The bear began to work her way along the wall, essentially shuffling sideways up the incline while keeping Sage secure and elevated above the rushing water. The water was at their heels now, carrying with it a deadly cargo of broken branches and rocks. Each impact against the tunnel walls sent vibrations through the stone, and Sage could hear the structure groaning under the pressure. S-17's fur was plastered to her body with a mixture of water and sweat, yet her movements remained precise and controlled. The bear was obviously tiring. Her breathing had become heavy and labored, but she never faltered in her protective positioning. A shaft of daylight pierced the gloom ahead of them, revealing an opening about 20 feet above. The tunnel had become almost vertical, its walls slick with water and moss. Under normal circumstances, this would have been an impossible climb, especially while carrying both Sage and the wheelchair. But S-17 was far from normal, and what happened next demonstrated just how extraordinary she truly was. The bear paused for a moment, surveying the vertical shaft with an almost human-like intensity. Her eyes moved methodically from one point to another, mapping out a route. Then she made a series of gestures that Sage recognized from Dr. Chen's notes. Paw to chest, then to the ground, followed by a sweeping motion upward. The message was clear. Trust me. Hold tight. We're going up. S-17's climbing technique revealed yet another layer of her remarkable intelligence. Instead of attempting a direct ascent, she began moving in a spiral pattern up the shaft, using the curved walls to create a more manageable slope. The bear braced herself against opposite sides of the shaft, her powerful legs and shoulders working in perfect coordination to maintain their stability. The folded wheelchair, still gripped firmly in her jaws, actually served as a counterweight, helping her maintain balance. Sage found herself thinking of the complex physics involved in what S-17 was doing. The careful distribution of weight, the calculation of friction and force needed for each movement. The bear wasn't just strong. She was applying principles that human climbers spent years learning to master. How much of this was Project Echo's training, and how much was S-17's own problem-solving ability? The water continued to rise below them, its roar becoming deafening in the confined space. The sound seemed to energize S-17, pushing her to move faster despite her obvious exhaustion. Each time debris crashed against the walls behind them, the bear would adjust her position to better shield Sage from any potential ricochets. This constant awareness of threat and protective positioning went far beyond simple trained responses. About halfway up the shaft, they encountered a section where the walls were particularly smooth, offering few handholds. S-17 paused again, her sides heaving with exertion. Then she did something that would have revolutionized our understanding of tool use in bears. She wedged the folded wheelchair into a narrow crack in the rock face, creating an artificial platform. Using this as a stepping point, she was able to reach a more stable section of the wall above. The gesture reminded Sage of another entry from Dr. Chen's notebook. S-17 consistently demonstrates the ability to repurpose objects in novel ways. Today, she used her water bowl as a step to reach a higher platform, something we had never taught her or demonstrated. This suggests not just learning, but true innovation. Now, years later, S-17 was applying that same innovative thinking to save both their lives. As they neared the top of the shaft, a new sound cut through the roar of the water. The distinctive crack of stone giving way. A large section of the wall just below them began to crumble, destabilized by the relentless flood. S-17 reacted with almost supernatural speed, lunging upward toward the opening. Her powerful muscles bunched and released in one explosive movement, propelling them toward the light. They burst out of the tunnel into driving rain, emerging on a steep hillside well above the flood level. S-17 didn't stop moving until they were several yards from the opening, finally setting the wheelchair down in a relatively flat area sheltered by a cluster of pine trees. Only then did she carefully lower herself to allow Sage to slide off her back. The bear's entire body was trembling with exhaustion, her breathing ragged and labored. Yet her first action was to turn and check on Sage, gently nosing her arm as if to ask if she was all right. The level of concern and attention she showed was remarkable. She even began attempting to unfold the wheelchair, though her paws were shaking too much to manage the mechanism. Sage reached out and placed her hand on S-17's massive shoulder, feeling the powerful muscles still quivering from their ordeal. The bear went still at her touch, then slowly turned to meet her gaze. In that moment, looking into those intelligent eyes, Sage understood something profound about the nature of consciousness and connection. The line between human and animal intelligence wasn't a line at all. It was a spectrum, and creatures like S-17 inhabited a space on that spectrum that science had barely begun to understand. The rain had begun to ease, though thunder still rolled in the distance. Sage could see the valley below them, transformed by the flood into a vast, churning lake. The tunnel they had escaped through was now completely submerged, water gushing from its opening like a fire hose. Their timing had been perfect, or rather, S-17's judgment had been perfect. The bear had somehow known exactly how long they had to make their escape. Sage's hands were shaking as she pulled Dr. Chen's notebook from inside her jacket. Remarkably, it had stayed relatively dry, protected by her rain gear. She began to read more carefully now, understanding dawning as she pieced together the full scope of what Project Echo had discovered. The research team hadn't just trained bears to respond to commands. They had unlocked something far more fundamental about ursine intelligence. According to Dr. Chen's notes, SS-17 had shown unprecedented abilities in several key areas: tool creation and modification, spatial reasoning, emotional intelligence, and perhaps most remarkably, the capacity for altruistic behavior. The bear had demonstrated all of these abilities during their escape. The way she had used the wheelchair as both a tool and a climbing aid, her complex route planning through the tunnel, her constant awareness of Sage's safety and comfort, and her willingness to risk her own life to save another being. As if reading her thoughts, S-17 moved closer, gently nudging the notebook with her nose. The bear's curiosity about the object that held Sage's attention was another sign of her remarkable intelligence. Sage began reading passages aloud, her voice soft but steady in the aftermath of their ordeal. S-17's ears twitched at the sound, and she settled down beside Sage, listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. Day 134. Sage read. S-17 continues to surprise us. Today, she observed one of our younger researchers struggling to reach a high shelf. Without any prompting, she retrieved a sturdy box from across the room and pushed it over to create a step. When this wasn't quite tall enough, she stacked a second box on top of the first. This level of problem-solving, identifying a need, developing a solution, and refining that solution based on results, is unprecedented in ursine subjects. SS-17 made a low, rumbling sound that Sage could have sworn was acknowledgement. The bear's eyes remained fixed on her face as she continued reading. More remarkable still is S-17's apparent capacity for empathy. She consistently responds to signs of distress in both her fellow test subjects and human researchers. When one of our older bears was having difficulty with a task, S-17 not only demonstrated the correct solution, but then stayed nearby, offering what can only be described as encouragement. The implications of Dr. Chen's research were staggering. Project Echo hadn't just been about training bears. It had been about discovering the true extent of their cognitive and emotional capabilities. The project's sudden shutdown made more sense now. The idea that bears could possess this level of intelligence, that the gap between human and animal consciousness might be far smaller than previously thought, would have profound implications for everything from wildlife conservation to our understanding of consciousness itself. Sage looked up from the notebook to find S-17 watching her with those incredibly expressive eyes. The bear had moved into a more relaxed position, but her attention never wavered. She was still protecting Sage, even now that the immediate danger had passed. This protective instinct wasn't just training or conditioning. It was a choice made by a being capable of understanding and responding to complex situations. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance caught both their attention. Search and rescue must have been mobilized when the storm hit. S-17's ears perked up at the sound, and she rose to her feet, moving with purpose toward Sage's folded wheelchair. With careful movements, she began attempting to unfold it again. This time, her paws were steadier, and Sage could see the methodical way she approached the mechanism, testing each part before moving to the next. Sage's throat tightened with emotion as she watched. This wasn't just a wild animal that had been trained to help humans. This was a being making conscious choices, solving problems, and showing genuine concern for another creature's well-being. The fact that she was doing all this years after Project Echo's end, with no reward or reinforcement, spoke to something far deeper than simple conditioning. The helicopter sound grew louder, and S-17's behavior changed subtly. She quickened her efforts with the wheelchair, finally managing to unfold it completely. Then she did something that brought tears to Sage's eyes. She carefully checked each wheel, spinning them to ensure they still worked properly, before positioning the chair next to Sage. The level of understanding and forethought in these actions was extraordinary. As Sage settled back into her chair, a bittersweet realization washed over her. Soon, rescuers would arrive, and S-17 would need to retreat into the wilderness. The bear seemed to sense this too. She made a series of gestures that Sage now recognized from Dr. Chen's notes, paw to chest, then to ear, followed by a sweeping motion toward the forest. The message was clear: danger approaching, time to separate. But there was something else in the bear's movements, a hesitation that spoke of reluctance to leave. The notebook in Sage's lap felt heavier now, weighted with responsibility. Within its pages lay evidence of something revolutionary, proof that animals like S-17 possessed levels of intelligence and emotional capacity that could transform our understanding of consciousness itself. But the notebook also contained warnings. Dr. Chen's final entries spoke of the dangers S-17 would face if her true capabilities became widely known. Some would want to capture her for research. Others would fear her intelligence and see her as a threat. Thunder rolled again in the distance as Sage made her decision. She carefully tore several blank pages from the back of the notebook and began writing rapidly, documenting everything that had happened during their escape. She described S-17's problem-solving abilities, her use of tools, her complex communication, and most importantly, her capacity for empathy and altruistic behavior. When she finished, she tucked these new pages deep inside her jacket, separate from Dr. Chen's original notebook. This level of problem-solving, identifying a need, developing a solution, and refining that solution based on results, is unprecedented in Ursine subjects. SS-17 made a low rumbling sound that Sage could have sworn was acknowledgement. The bear's eyes remained fixed on her face as she continued reading. More remarkable still is S-17's apparent capacity for empathy. She consistently responds to signs of distress in both her fellow test subjects and human researchers. When one of our older bears was having difficulty with a task, S-17 not only demonstrated the correct solution, but then stayed nearby, offering what can only be described as encouragement. The implications of Dr. Chen's research were staggering. Project Echo hadn't just been about training bears. It had been about discovering the true extent of their cognitive and emotional capabilities. The project's sudden shutdown made more sense now. The idea that bears could possess this level of intelligence, that the gap between human and animal consciousness might be far smaller than previously thought, would have profound implications for everything from wildlife conservation to our understanding of consciousness itself. Sage looked up from the notebook to find S-17 watching her with those incredibly expressive eyes. The bear had moved into a more relaxed position, but her attention never wavered. She was still protecting Sage, even now that the immediate danger had passed. This protective instinct wasn't just training or conditioning, it was a choice, made by a being capable of understanding and responding to complex situations. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance caught both their attention. Search and rescue must have been mobilized when the storm hit. S-17's ears perked up at the sound, and she rose to her feet, moving with purpose toward Sage's folded wheelchair. With careful movements, she began attempting to unfold it again. This time, her paws were steadier, and Sage could see the methodical way she approached the mechanism, testing each part before moving to the next. Sage's throat tightened with emotion as she watched. This wasn't just a wild animal that had been trained to help humans. This was a being making conscious choices, solving problems, and showing genuine concern for another creature's well-being. The fact that she was doing all this years after Project Echo's end, with no reward or reinforcement, spoke to something far deeper than simple conditioning. The helicopter sound grew louder, and S-17's behavior changed subtly. She quickened her efforts with the wheelchair, finally managing to unfold it completely. Then she did something that brought tears to Sage's eyes. She carefully checked each wheel, spinning them to ensure they still worked properly before positioning the chair next to Sage. The level of understanding and forethought in these actions was extraordinary. As Sage settled back into her chair, a bittersweet realization washed over her. Soon, rescuers would arrive, and S-17 would need to retreat into the wilderness. The bear seemed to sense this too. She made a series of gestures that Sage now recognized from Dr. Chen's notes. Paw to chest, then to ear, followed by a sweeping motion toward the forest. The message was clear. Danger approaching. Time to separate. But there was something else in the bear's movements. A hesitation that spoke of reluctance to leave. The notebook in Sage's lap felt heavier now, weighted with a responsibility. Within its pages lay evidence of something revolutionary. Proof that animals like S-17 possessed levels of intelligence and emotional capacity that could transform our understanding of consciousness itself. But the notebook also contained warnings. Dr. Chen's final entries spoke of the dangers S-17 would face if her true capabilities became widely known. Some would want to capture her for research. Others would fear her intelligence and see her as a threat. Thunder rolled again in the distance as Sage made her decision. She carefully tore several blank pages from the back of the notebook and began writing rapidly, documenting everything that had happened during their escape. She described S-17's problem-solving abilities, her use of tools, her complex communication, and most importantly, her capacity for empathy and altruistic behavior. When she finished, she tucked these new pages deep inside her jacket, separate from Dr. Chen's original notebook.